Mr. Adolphsen, you have 5 minutes.
Chairman Krishnamurthy, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. Millionaires should not be eligible for food stamps. Neither should someone with $20,000 in the bank, a new four-wheeler or jet ski in the garage, or the owner of a private aircraft. And state government should do basic checks to make sure only the truly needy receive food stamps. This isn't complicated or a conspiracy or even controversial. It's just common sense. Food stamps are meant for the neediest Americans. And I've witnessed firsthand how an innocent-sounding policy like broad-based categorical eligibility, known as BBCE, can open the door wide to fraud and abuse. When I was the Chief Operating Officer at the Maine Department of Health and Human Services and oversaw food stamp eligibility, we struggled to maintain integrity in the program because of BBCE. Someone on welfare in Maine actually owned an airplane. And recently, a millionaire detailed how easy it was for him to get welfare benefits legally thanks to BBCE. Congress did its job in setting eligibility standards for the food stamp program. And Congress also had a good idea in trying to reduce administrative duplication by allowing automatic enrollment for some other welfare recipients. But what Congress meant for good, bureaucrats used as a gimmick. Rather than reduce administrative costs, the Clinton administration exploited the policy to maximize enrollment. Here's how it works. Anyone who receives a brochure printed with money from another welfare program is automatically enrolled, with the ridiculous justification that it's the same as receiving a real welfare benefit. And that loophole is so bad today that the welfare office often deems applicants eligible based on the possibility of receiving the so-called benefit. They don't even receive that. Then, no one looks at a bank account. There are no asset checks of any kind. And the income limit is instantly expanded by nearly double in most states, all with a wave of the magic welfare wand. It's the epitome of welfare fraud. And unfortunately, it has the federal stamp of approval in more than 40 states. The result is that millions of people with significant assets who are ineligible according to law are on food stamps. Many of these recipients have incomes up to double the federal poverty level. That means they could be eligible for food stamps with nearly the same income level as the average American household. For the truly needy who depend on the food stamp program, that just simply is not fair. And it's not fair to Congress, who wrote the law and made it clear that it does not want food stamps for all, but rather food stamps for those who truly need them. The administrative state should never have been allowed to expand welfare beyond what Congress sanctioned, and the rule put forward by the Trump administration will correct that overreach. Because this is such a practical change, those opposed to closing this loophole have decided to pivot to talking points about a program that is only loosely connected to food stamps, the school lunch program. The truth is, the real impact of this rule on school lunches is virtually zero. In fact, in 34 states, not one single child will lose their school lunch eligibility as a result of this rule. And in the other states, a child eligible for free or reduced school lunch based on their income level, as set in federal law, will remain eligible for free and reduced school lunch. Very few, just 9,600 out of 30 million kids who receive free or reduced school lunch, may need to pay their portion for the school lunch because they used to be eligible only through this loophole. There may be actually zero impact because kids in continuing eligibility provision schools will continue to get free lunches regardless of their income or welfare enrollment, with no eligibility process at all. Those schools give universal free lunch today. The Trump administration should be applauded for this simple, common sense rule. Especially now in this booming economy, It makes sense to close loopholes and government gimmicks and transition adults and their families from welfare to work, from government dependency to self-sufficiency in the American dream. Thank you.
Big difference. In your opinion, is it safe to assume that the 7 million off of food stamps are a result of a stronger economy?
Oh, there's no question about it. Record number of open jobs, record number of people going back to work. There have also been reforms done at the state level that have helped spur this change. Work requirements have come back into effect in a number of states, and we've seen great results with people moving from welfare to work and back into the workforce.
I'd like to hear more about your time that you spent in the Maine Department of Health and Human Services. You oversaw operations for their welfare programs. What were the most important key takeaways from your experience, and how do they relate to today's discussion?
Sure, thank you for that question. Just as it relates to BBCE, I can tell you a little bit more about what I saw and why this has this connection to fraud. When someone is approved through BBCE, and 97% of all people on food stamps in BBCE states are approved through BBCE, there is no asset check at all. And so what happens is information that would normally be available to you as an agency to determine and verify their status, household composition, income sources, other things like that, the agency does not even look at all. So the challenge there is it opens the door to fraud, as I mentioned. The GAO said people who come in through BBCE 3 times more likely to have errors. And in 2011, the Obama administration actually stopped looking at BBC cases for payment errors. And so that isn't even reflected in this percentage of fraud that folks are referencing.
How many people would that be?
Well, it's hard to come up with an exact number because we don't check assets now. So just a quick example, the largest fraud case in Maine history, over $200,000 a woman stole. She didn't report that her husband lived with her. Well, she was on the program through BBCE, and so her assets weren't checked. When they later found this fraud through a report, they looked at her bank accounts, and her husband was listed as a joint owner of the bank account. That was fraud that could have been caught had we checked things like assets at the front door, which BBCE does not allow.
Okay, I yield back my time.
Conversation to have. Mr. Adolphsen, did I pronounce that right? Okay. Now, this is a little wonky. We just heard that this rule changes SNAP. Is that actually right, or is that, could you clarify the connection, because it's not really as direct as it's being?
Sure. Yes, sir. So the rule that's being discussed is a change to SNAP, not to the school lunch program. The SNAP eligibility standards as set in federal law, as have been mentioned, you cannot have income over 130% of the federal poverty level, and you cannot have liquid assets available to you, cash, recreational vehicles, things you could quickly liquidate to cash in excess of $2,250. So the broad-based categorical eligibility loophole does away with that asset test, and it raises that income threshold to up to 200% in most states and up to 185% or 165% in other states. Where the school lunch comes into play is that if you're on SNAP, you're automatically eligible for school lunch with no application. And that's what some folks are talking about, that there's a group of students who may have to apply with a school lunch application. I grabbed one here from the state of Maine. It's one page. They may have to apply through that application, but they will still maintain their eligibility. It just won't be automatic.
And it was also stated that 3 million people would lose SNAP benefits, but it's actually, could you explain the difference between losing eligibility versus actually losing benefits?
Sure. So right now there are approximately 5 million people who are ineligible by federal law standards. And when this loophole is closed in broad-based categorical eligibility, that pathway is closed, it will go back to categorical eligibility. If you're actually receiving a welfare benefit, you will still be automatically eligible for food stamps. That is not changing. The only thing that's changing is you can't get this brochure handed to you and thus getting rid of the asset test and increasing the income limit. That piece of it will go away. And so then we'll go back to the federal standards that are in law that Congress passed of both income and asset limits.
So to rephrase it, you're basically saying that the executive branch is working to realign regulations with the stated will of Congress as passed in law?
That's correct. The BBCE rule was created entirely through regulation. At the time, the Clinton administration even acknowledged that the intent was to expand this to people who are actually getting a benefit, not just receiving, or in many cases, not even receiving a marginal, TANF-funded brochure. And they acknowledged that at the time, but it has taken on a life of its own, obviously, as 42 states are using it and millions of folks have come in through that pathway. So this rule simply reorients the eligibility policy at the practical level on the ground with what Congress actually passed in law.
Okay. And so constitutionally, the proper way to fix this would be for Congress to act if it wants to change its will?
Absolutely, and I mentioned in my remarks, if you want to give everyone in the country food stamps, you have the authority to do that, pass a law, and get it signed into law, and that certainly can take effect. But as the law stands right now, this regulation sits squarely outside of it, and it's really incumbent upon the administration to correct that.
Okay. And thank you. I yield back.
I'm going to use that 5 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Adolphsen, how much do you pay each month for electricity and how often?
How often? Each month. I could get my phone out and check exactly, but it's probably about
Would you?
probably about $180 to $200 a month, depending on how many lights the kids leave on.
Tell me about your children. How many do you have, may I ask?
I have 3 children.
And they're school age?
They are not. One of them is in kindergarten.
And then the other 2 are younger. Great. How much and how often do you pay for sewer?
Once every 4 years when the septic truck comes to clean it out.
How much and how often do you pay for house insurance, homeowners insurance?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
How much and how often do you pay for homeowners insurance?
Let's see, that's once a year I purchased that policy.
How many hours did you work weekly last week?
I don't know.
What is your hourly rate of, let me ask you this, because I don't want to invade your privacy. Do you know your hourly rate of pay as you sit here today?
Yes, ma'am, I know how much I get paid.
Hourly?
I do not get paid hourly.
But you're going to need to know that. So do you know right now how much you
Well,
get paid, calculated
With all
as an
due
hourly
respect,
thing?
what does this have to do with the broad-based categorical
I
eligibility?
respect, I actually get to ask the questions with all due respect, and you either can answer them or refuse to answer them, which is your prerogative. Do you know your gross pay before deductions?
I do.
Do you know what day of the week your paycheck is received on?
Yes, I do.
What day is that?
I'm not going to answer that.
Okay. Let's go through, do you know whether you own any certificates of deposit?
I know my financial situation quite well.
How about your account number for your IRA or 401k?
My account number? No, I don't have that handy, but I could get it in about 11 seconds.
Tick-tock. I'll wait.
I'm going to be respectful and keep my phone in my pocket as we're asked to do.
Okay, the reason I'm asking you all these things, Mr. Adolphsen, is I want to show you what the main the state of Maine's application for food supplement looks like for SNAP.
Yes, ma'am, I ran that program for 4 years.
Okay, this is a 6-page application for SNAP. I asked you a handful of these questions to fill all of this out. Ooh, there's so many pages, I'm dropping them, I apologize. This is a handful of what you would have to fill out. This is information that is much more extensive than, for example, I am required to provide in my congressionally mandated financial disclosures as a member of the House of Representatives to the American public. Are you aware, let me ask you this question, what does the research say about what happens when you increase the paperwork and informational burdens on applications for things like SNAP or cash benefits? What does the research say?
I'm not sure what research you're referring to, Representative.
The research conducted by folks like Elder Shafir and others about what happens when you make the paperwork application burden longer. What happens to eligibility?
Well, I can tell you my experience in Maine administering the program was that the vast majority of applications were completed online or on the telephone, not through paper application. And we actually, under my watch, undertook a process to streamline that even further so that it would be easy for folks to get on the computer. We set up kiosks right in the regional offices where we provided computers and support for people.
Are those offices in Maine open on nights or weekends?
Yes, we had night and weekend hours. We actually changed our staffing rotation to give 2 nights of the week where we stayed open into the evening.
I really commend that. I think that's really important. With that, I'll yield back.
Recognize Congressman Comer for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my questions are going to be centered around the able-bodied adults without dependents rule for Mr. Adolphsen. And I apologize for the questions you got earlier. I don't know what the purpose of those were, but unfortunately, the civility and common sense in Congress is sometimes in a downward spiral here. It doesn't help when the Speaker of the House rips up the State of the Union right behind the President after he gives his remarks, but that's for another day. That's for another day. If anyone disagrees with that, we can debate that here, but let's get back to what's important, and that's governing. With respect to the new rule, before the December 2019 USDA rule on SNAP work requirements, how were states taking advantage of the waiver systems as it relates to work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents?
Sure, thank you. So on the ABOD rule, what states were doing was they were taking counties in various areas that had fairly low unemployment, and they were grouping them with other unrelated counties that had high unemployment, higher unemployment, and they were getting permission to waive those work requirements kind of across the board. In California, for example, statewide waiver even among counties with 2% and 3% unemployment.
How many states were waiving the work requirement?
More than 30, depending on what time period you pick.
So how does the 2019 USDA rule seek to clarify and update work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents?
Sure, for those 18 to 49-year-old able-bodied adults with no kids, what the rule does is it simply changes the criteria to be more in line with federal law, which says that an area that has high unemployment can receive a waiver. And so what the rule does very generally is it makes sure that those waivers can only apply in specific areas that actually do have an economic depression or downturn.
Okay. So during your time with the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, how significant was the implementation of work requirements?
From an administrative perspective, it was no more difficult than really any of the changes that we often receive from our legislature or through regulation. We did some work to make sure that folks had a place to go to education and training if they chose to do that, and we worked with our Department of Labor to set up those career center one-stops and those types of things.
Let me ask you this. Have you seen where the implementation of work requirements could have actually helped SNAP recipients?
Absolutely. We've seen that really in states across the country, Florida, Mississippi, Arkansas come to mind. We've done studies there following each individual person who work requirements applied to. Incomes more than doubled in a year. Folks went back to work in hundreds of different industries, and they're doing much better now, earning more and enough to replace the benefit and more.
Right. Could you explain how USDA's December 2019 work requirement rule seeks to ensure SNAP recipients achieve self-sufficiency?
Yeah, the bottom line is we've got one of the greatest economies that we've had in decades, and we have nearly 7 million open jobs. Right. And the USDA looked at these waivers and said, we really need these folks, able-bodied, and to get into these jobs,
right,
get off the sidelines and into the workforce. It helps them, and it helps our economy.
That's exactly right, and the biggest complaint that I hear from job creators and business owners in my congressional district, and throughout Kentucky for that matter, is the fact that they cannot expand their business. They're not going to invest additional capital because they don't have confidence that they can fill the open positions that would be created. And we already have, in my district, which is a poor district, tens of thousands of jobs open right now. And if you poll the people, the working people in my district, and ask them, do you support work requirements for able-bodied adults that receive any type of welfare benefits, that would poll close to 100%. So this is something that I appreciate the administration trying to adopt, and anything I can do to see that this happens, I'm certainly going to do it because that's what the people in my district want. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you for sharing such a personal story. Mr. Adolphsen, if Ms. Sullivan came to you and she says she's at 140% of federal poverty line and she told you her story, would you believe that she should get food stamps? Yes or no?
I would follow the eligibility standards.
So if she came to you, she said, look, I'm having to skip meals and my kids are, otherwise my kids would go hungry and I need this, and you believed it to be true, but it's 140% over the federal poverty line, you would say, no, she doesn't qualify?
You know, personally, I would help if I could.
Well, you were administrating Maine. I'm just saying,
yeah.
Were these the type of cases someone came to you, if they were 140%, would you say yes or would you say no?
Well, with BBCE, she would be eligible, so I would say yes.
I would not.
But under the federal law, food stamp eligibility, she would be ineligible.
I mean, you would, so what the Trump administration is doing is trying to make her ineligible, and you would support that. You would think that someone like Ms. Sullivan shouldn't get food stamps. I just want to be clear because, you know, I saw your testimony about private planes and all that. Let's just be honest here. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether someone like Ms. Sullivan, who's at 140% of poverty line, should get food stamps or not. Now, if you want to say that no, she shouldn't, at least that's an honest answer. And that's, you know, that we could just have a difference of values. But let's be very clear about that position.
Sir, I'm being honest, and the broad-based categorical eligibility loophole that's being closed by this rule, as I mentioned in my testimony, is much more about assets than income, and you heard from several testimonies that income is the smaller piece of this particular rule, and I'm being completely honest about what this rule does. As a state administrator,
let me just have one question because my
you don't
time's
make an
running up.
individual determination.
If I could just finish. How much money would this rule save the federal government?
It's several $1 billion.
How much exactly?
It depends on the final
What's your
rule, which
estimate?
has not come out yet.
So, I mean, so you're basically saying for $2 to $3 billion, you don't even know how much it would save, which is less than 1% of our defense budget, you would deprive millions of Ms. Sullivans of food. I mean, that, just so we have our priorities. I mean, that's basically your policy argument to this committee,
This is about preserving the resources for the truly needy who are eligible by federal law.
which is less than 1% of our defense budget, to deprive, probably 1 million people like Ms. Sullivan of food.
I'm not prepared to discuss the defense budget at this food stamp hearing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Khanna. I now recognize Congressman Grothman for 5 minutes of questioning.
Yeah, I kind of want to go over this one more time. Could you one more time give us an overview of this of the categorical eligibility and how it came about?
Certainly. So categorical eligibility is allowed in federal food stamp law. It says if you are receiving a welfare benefit, you are automatically eligible to be enrolled in the food stamp program. That was Congress's effort to cut down on administrative and applicant burden. Fine. What happened was the Clinton administration came in and they expanded that to broad-based categorical eligibility that said a welfare benefit can be as simple as getting a brochure. You don't have to get an actual benefit from this other welfare program. And by doing that, the income limit is then raised from 130 of the federal poverty level up to 200% of the federal poverty level, and the asset test is completely eliminated through that process.
Okay, and do you know off the top of your head what 200% of federal poverty is? I used to know these numbers. I can't remember.
It's in the mid 30,000 range.
Okay, and the asset test, just like on other things, means you can be a millionaire and eligible for the program?
Yeah, it ranges widely. We know from USDA data that half of these individuals have more than $20,000 in liquid assets.
Is there any downside that you can think of to putting people on the lunch program, other than just cost?
Any downside to putting people on the school lunch program?
Correct.
As long as it complies with the standards that Congress set for the program, I see no problem with it.
Okay. What I was trying to get at, Mr. Adolphsen, is sometimes it's said that when you give more benefits, it kind of affects the parents because they have less responsibility for their children. I guess I'll put it that way. And it's good if you have more, I guess, buy-in on your children's upbringing. Do you see any of that, or does that argument appeal to you at all?
Well, as the parent of children, I certainly want to be involved in their upbringing and taking care of them. I think what we're talking about, though, is for folks who are on SNAP through BBCE, they either have incomes that are in excess of the federal limit that was set, or they have resources that are available to them to take care of themselves and their families without the benefit.
I guess what I'm trying to get at, are there benefits to giving parents responsibility other than just monetary benefits to the federal government? And understand, we're running almost $1 trillion a year deficit, so I don't mean to minimize the cost savings. We should always be looking for the cost savings. But you read stuff about it kind of affecting parents as the government assumes more and more of that parental role.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone would disagree that all the literature supports that active involvement in their children's lives by the parents is critical to their success.
Okay. I'll yield the remainder of my time.